Hi, welcome to another episode of the Financial Freedom Podcast. I'm Steve Richardson, a bankruptcy attorney trying to keep people on their path to financial stability and independence through education. Lots of people dream of owning their own business. They have that entrepreneurial itch that needs to be scratched. But most startup businesses fail because they're hard to get started and grow. But what if you were to buy an already thriving business? How would that work? To answer those questions, I spoke with CFO and business advisor Karl Maier. He has some great tips and ideas on how to be successful in buying a business. My guest today is Karl Maier, an experienced CFO and business advisor who has played a key role in doubling sales at 5 companies in just 2 years. His company, Abundant, is dedicated to helping businesses grow by understanding their numbers, building repeatable business systems, and organizing their team, particularly in today's challenging economy with inflation, labor shortages, and supply chain disruptions. Carl's experience spans expanding credit lines, leading multi-million dollar acquisitions, and enhancing profitability through innovative pricing systems, and financial strategies. Welcome to the show, Karl.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be here.
Yeah. So I mentioned before we hit record that in previous episodes I've talked to experts on topics like starting your own business, growing your own business, selling your business, uh, expanding it, that sort of thing. But I've never really talked to anybody about buying an existing business. And there may be people that out there among our listeners who have that entrepreneurial itch that want to own a business, but they may not want to go through all the headaches and work involved in starting and building one from scratch. So I thought to talk to you about things that they need to do to make sure they can ensure the best chance of success in purchasing a business. Now, I understand when you talk to folks about this, you list 3 proven steps in doing it successfully: communicate, analyze, and acquire. So let's step through that, starting with communicate. Now, what do you mean by that as a first stage? What kind of communication are we talking about here?
Right. Communication is very important in any relationship. And with an acquisition, I mean, you think about it, you're starting a new relationship potentially with new employees, new customers, the existing owners. You may have an ongoing relationship depending on how the deal works out.
Mm-hmm.
So, how you communicate is very important. That could fall into a number of different pieces. One is setting reasonable expectations about, what's this process look like? If somebody is selling their business, this may be, the only time they've gone through any kind of acquisition. So they may not know exactly, or they may have some ideas of what to expect, and it may be different than what the process you're going to be walking them through. So that's an important consideration.
So we're going to get to analyze in a minute. And obviously, there's a lot of due diligence involved whenever you buy a business. But as
Right.
far as initial communications are concerned, what kind of questions should the business buyer be asking of the person that wants to sell it?
Well, the first question, of course, is, are you interested in selling?
Hmm.
And these days, there's a lot of people out there looking to buy businesses. There's a lot of businesses for sale too. But are you interested in selling and helping them to, communicate with them why you might be a good fit to buy their business and why it'd be a successful transaction? So that's one thing you'd want to communicate. Another thing then is to understand, where are they at? What are their goals? What are they trying to achieve? Are they trying to retire? Do they want to be, part of maybe get more capital to grow to the next level? Maybe you can bring more management skills or talent to help them grow. So what are their goals is really important in my mind as well.
Hmm. Well, certainly, you might want to dig a little deeper as to why they're selling. I mean, you say they may be retiring and
Mhm.
say, well, our kids don't want to take over the business if it's a family business, or they're just tired of doing that and want to do something else, but they may be selling it because it's going downhill. It's not doing well, and they're trying to unload it. So yeah, they're certainly not going to tell you that when you say, "Well, why are you selling?" So we've gone through sort of the initial questions, but how do we probe a little bit further? How do we try and if it's not because hey we're retiring or we just don't want to do this anymore, how do we probe a little bit further before we get to analyze to see, are they on the up and up with this?
Right, because like you say, you want to dig deeper, but they may not be just ready to kind of show you everything. They may want to understand, that you're going to make some sort of an offer before they're going to show you all the books or,
Mm-hmm.
check out all their customers and things like that. So, using questions to kind of dig a little bit deeper, maybe, well, without telling me the names of the customer, how much of the business is with your biggest customer, your biggest two or three customers, so you can start to get a sense of is there customer concentration.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what's happening in your industry? That's kind of an open-ended discussion of, what's the competition like? Are depending on what type of business it is, how far are they selling? Are they selling nationally or selling in the city? Are they just selling within a couple miles? So understanding, you can have a lot of those type of questions just to dig in and get a better sense of what's going on. And sometimes, they will kind of answer the question without fully thinking about it. Maybe you'll kind of get a hint at some of the things you're talking about, that the industry's changing, there's a big new competitor, there's new technology, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So just so I guess politely kind of poke around and see what it reveals. Uh, Anything else under communicate before we move on to analyze?
Well, can I tell you a real quick story? I've got a, company I'm working with now. They're in manufacturing and industry, very specialized manufacturing company, and they're trying to buy one of their most direct competitors
Mm-hmm.
who removed geographically. So what they did was, rather than only talk kind of owner to owner, the seller was more comfortable saying, "Hey, I'll share some of this information with you, Karl,
Mm-hmm.
but you have to say that you're not going to share it with my competitor until we sign an LOI, a letter of intent.
Mm-hmm.
So we set a price. So we've kind of moved down a certain. So I'll show you the numbers, and you can kind of analyze them to a certain degree. Well, not all the numbers, but a lot more numbers and financial statements. But you've got to kind of keep it from going to that other owner because it's a competitive issue for them.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a way you can use professionals, whether it's, CPAs or brokers or attorneys, to help kind of buffer and also be part of that communication, even
Mm-hmm.
at a stage.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another part of the communication.
So it helps to have a middleman like you when you're negotiating, because then especially if a competitive marketplace, right? You're looking to sell this business, but you don't want this information to get out there uh, to anybody, to your competitors. Someone comes up and expresses an interest in buying your business. You're not going to, without, like I said, a letter of intent, without something a little bit more serious uh, to show that you as a buyer are more serious. So it helps to have a middleman. Is that something that you do? Act as a middleman, or how does that work?
Well, there's middlemen like a broker, and if it's a bigger deal, an investment bank, that are officially middlemen. They
Mm-hmm.
are getting paid just to make the deal happen.
Mm-hmm.
And my role is typically it is helping the transaction from one of the parties' point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not trying to bring the deal together as much as I am supporting the deal.
Mm-hmm.
So In this particular case, I was helping the seller and I'm getting paid by the seller. Or sorry, I'm helping the buyer and getting paid by the buyer.
Mhm.
But the seller was more comfortable talking to me because I'm just a, you know, part-time. I come into this transaction, do a project. I'm focused on this project. So they're like, if I give you the information, you're not going to be my competitor, even if this deal doesn't go through. So I'm a supporting professional service provider. So, and that's a little different than the broker because the broker's motivations are going to be a little bit different. My loyalties to the buyer, the brokers is typically to the deal and often to to the seller. So, there's
Okay.
different roles in there.
So when it comes to communication, this first step to our listeners who maybe think, I said, thinking about buying a business, having a middleman or middle person or whatever, an agent, can grease the skids in the communication stage of things because the seller is going to be more comfortable talking to that middleman than they might be to a potential buyer.
Right. And, there's various professionals. The broker kind of middleman is one of them, but financial advice, legal advice are also valuable in that process as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right. So we've communicated initially. We've gotten to the point where the buyer is interested and wants to make an offer. What's that next step? Is there anything that happens between communication and analyze, which is really your due diligence?
Right. Yeah. Usually the transition between those two pieces is the letter of intent.
Okay.
A letter of intent is something, it sounds real fancy, but it's basically just a letter that says, this is what we're thinking. It's not a formal contract for the most part.
Mhm.
Is a non-binding statement of here's what we plan to do. We plan to buy your company. We might structure it in this way. This is how we're going to pay you for it. This is when we're going to close. But it's subject to all these, due diligence, like you say. So that's the transition. Everybody says, yeah, if everything goes as planned, that's what we'll do. But then we go to this next step, the analyze step that you just mentioned.
So let me, by way of analogy, from what you describe, if I'm understanding it correctly, is in a lot of ways it's like buying a home. You say you make an offer, you enter into a contract, and you set a price, you set a closing date, but there are warranties, there are inspections that are going to be gone through. There's you want to make sure title's clear and everything else because that's what stands between the contract and the closing is the due diligence. So that's very similar from what I understand you're saying in the purchase of a business. So when you do that letter of intent, you've already made an offer. You've already uh, picked a number, right? You said I will buy this business for X number of dollars.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a real good analogy. There are some tweaks, some slight differences
Right.
when you're buying a house, of course. With a house, usually, unless there's a big problem, you're probably pretty set on price and that closing date. With a business, there's just more variables.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not uncommon for there to be a shift in the price
Mm-hmm.
and maybe the terms a little bit as you go through due diligence. But broadly, I completely agree with your analogy there. So
So
yeah.
I guess the next question I have is how do you determine the price? How do you know what to offer? Are you offering too much? Are you offering too little? I mean, or is it just right? I mean, which of the three bears beds are we talking about here? And how do you choose which one? Uh, so what should the potential buyer be going through and looking at in determining uh, what to offer? Because like with a home, you have a list price, so you at least have some idea of uh, what they're asking for. The realtor may be able to give you a comparative market analysis to say, okay, homes in this area roughly go for this amount. So, yeah, their list might be a little high. There's some room there, and you talk it out and haggle. But with buying a business, how is that done? How do you arrive at that number?
Well, at a high level, I think what you described is pretty accurate. Again, it's just there's more complexity in buying a business. There's just more variables than there are in buying a home.
Hmm.
So, some of those things, you sometimes a company is like on the market for sale, and maybe a business broker or investment banker says we're taking this market,
Hmm.
and they even give some guidance on we're asking this price, very similar to a home. Other times you're going to know of a company that you want to buy and you're going to reach out to them. And so, yes, there's no asking price. You're kind of at the mercy of, figuring out the answer. What will they accept? What is that a good value? Am I paying too much? And so looking at the financials is a really good place to start.
Can
How
you get
much,
that kind of disclosure before a letter of intent? You talked about them not wanting to, you know, just reveal too much, certainly not their finances.
right?
Can you get that kind of information before doing a letter of intent? And if so, what kind of information can you get?
Right. So sometimes, depending on the size of the company and the relationship, if it's being listed with a broker, you'll get some summary information of where, sales are 1 million or 10 million, or what, how much sales did they do last year, or maybe even the last couple of years? How
Mhm.
much were the earnings the last few years? So very light on details,
Mhm.
but you don't know if they spent too much on they were buying boats, or, spending a bunch on consultants, or so you may not know everything about that, but you hopefully are going to get some level of detail. Sometimes you're going to have to sign a non-disclosure agreement to get that kind of information as well.
Mhm.
And so that should give you at least some guidance on what, what the financial aspect of the company looks like.
Mhm.
You know, I've seen situations where they're like, hey, we aren't listed for sale. If you really want us, you just tell us we're worth to you.
Mhm.
And, I've seen that happen. I've seen deals successfully close that way,
Mhm.
especially when you get like a larger company that sees, maybe, if you're the seller, you've got a company and you're maybe in a particular market.
Mhm.
With that company, they were a laundromat, wash and fold delivery type of company. And they were in the Austin area, and they had a national competitor that wanted to get into the Austin market. So they were willing to pay a lot more for this company to get established quickly in the Austin market, rather than trying to build, new locations. And so that one, it wasn't as much about the kind of financial price as
Mhm.
it was about operational strategically. Can we get these locations? Can we bring the management team in? So there was some value that they were looking at beyond just how much money are you making.
Mhm.
So, so that's a consideration as well. There's people, myself, many, the brokers are, going to give you guidance on, the business valuation professionals. I've got background in that as well, that will say this is for a company of this size.
Mhm.
You use comparables much like you would for a house, and we're looking at their financials, and we've come up with, we think it's worth, whatever it is, 1 million, 10 million, whatever the number might be. But then you have to, if you're going into this business, as an individual buying a company, you know, you're going to want to think about, how close is this to my house? Am I going to have to relocate?
Mhm.
There's non-financial issues that even an individual buyer may want to consider as well.
Mhm.
And then there's always the, do I like and trust this person?
Mhm.
That, do I like and trust the seller? Am I comfortable with them?
Yeah.
So it's not unheard of to, have lunch or dinner, just, break bread with a seller at some point as well, just to see if there's a fit, give
Mhm.
a sense of what might their management style be like? Are you going to be able to step into that role easily? Or, is it something where you're like, well, this person's really hard charging and I'm more laid back, or vice versa? So those are some other things to think about.
Mhm. And certainly, again, having a go-between, an agent to help you in the purchase process. I mean, our listeners are basically, husband and wife, if they're looking to start a business, more of a small business. They're not huge entrepreneurs. So certainly having, just like you would hire a realtor if you want to buy a home to advise you on the process, you're going to want to do that when you're buying a business. So,
Right.
okay, so that's the communication part. We've made the decision that, okay, we're going to make an offer on this business. We're going to do a letter of intent, and we've come up with an amount and the terms. Let's talk about the second stage, the analysis, the due diligence, if you will. Um, what are some of the key things that someone looking to purchase a business should analyze, and how should they do that?
Well, some of them are probably pretty obvious. You want to understand what the customer base looks like. You want to understand, how much their sales are, what the trends of, is sales been going up each year or has it been going down each year? Are you making money? Um, and there's something that a like a company might say, our sellers' discretionary earnings
Hmm.
are $300,000.
Hmm.
And that could be a really key number. So understanding what that number looks like. And so a seller's discretionary earnings would be, well, I pay myself 50,000 a year, but we earn enough money and that on top of that we earn another 100,000, so that's 150,000. But then I also spend, this much buying a truck. I buy a truck for myself every other year,
Hmm.
and insurance and gas. And so you kind of add back those things. And so understanding what those add backs are to get to that seller's discretionary no, earnings or whatever type, if there's a earnings before interest, depreciation, tax, and amortization, the EBITDA number that people sometimes talk about, usually on a little bit larger businesses, and those can also have an adjusted EBITDA with add backs. So understanding those add backs can be really important.
Hmm.
And then there's also, some of the things that are like a lot less exciting perhaps, is like legal. Are there any lawsuits out there? Is the corporate charter, is the corporation registered with the state in good standing? Those are, things you may not just kind of immediately think of, you
Hmm.
know, and so you've got, the legal, are the taxes fully paid? Are there payroll taxes outstanding? Researching those types of items, and just then understanding, how many people in the organization. Um, are you at the end of the transaction, are, is somebody going to owe them vacation benefits? I remember one entrepreneur that he had a nice business and he sold it, and he was really frustrated that he had to pay everybody. He had a generous vacation policy, and he had like 200 people, and so he had to pay them each on average about 2 weeks of vacation.
Hmm.
So that added up quite a bit, and that came out of the proceeds of the sale to him. So
Hmm.
having a good attorney, which I guess I'm kind of jumping into the third phase there, but you know, putting together that final agreement well
Hmm.
is something. So you do the due diligence so that you can put together a good final agreement.
Right. You want to think cash flow. You indicated whether the accounts receivable are steadily going up or steadily going down. whether there's seasonality to it. Are there slow seasons? Are there busy seasons so that you can, when you go into running this business, you can anticipate them and know, hey, we made a lot of money this quarter, but next quarter is going to be slow. So we should hold back on maybe distributing money to ourselves as owners and keep it in there for the slow time, but also what assets are owned by the company and how much are they leveraged. There may be a lot of financing that the business got for that collateralized a lot of the assets. So you may think you're buying a lot of assets in the business, but they're so tied up in financing, which may not be paid off with the purchase price, right?
Right. And so usually with the debt, usually the seller, it's the seller's responsibility to take care of that, any of the debts.
Hmm.
Most businesses, especially in the kind of smaller range we're talking about, we're going to buy them in what's called an asset sale.
Hmm.
We're as a buyer, we're going to buy primarily the assets of the company, inventory, the good name, the computer systems, things like that. We might take some of the payables, but we're not going to take like a bank note or credit card debt
Hmm.
as part of the transaction when we're doing asset sales. And that's the most common for, businesses in the kind of small to even mid-range size. There is another way to do it, which is a stock sale where you're actually buying the legal entity. As a buyer, you're usually not real excited about that. There's disadvantages from a tax point of view. There's also liability issues. If there's a lawsuit hanging out there, that would be attributable to the company, to the corporation or LLC,
Hmm.
and you don't really want to buy that. So that's something to keep in mind.
Hmm.
And I guess another thing is to your point about what assets are you buying, one of the common ones to kind of easily overlook is what's the situation with the real estate? So I had a situation, I was talking to a company about buying them, and the real estate was owned by the um, current owner, the seller. They'd owned it for a long time, so they didn't have any debt on it. They paid it off and they owned it personally. And then they had a company. It was a nice company, it was making money, but the company wasn't paying themselves rent. And since there's no note on the real estate, they hadn't really, they thought of themselves as really profitable. But for somebody who's buying the company, you've got to keep in mind that you're either going to buy that piece of real estate, and that's kind of a separate transaction, or you're going to sign a lease with that owner and you're going to rent the real estate, right?
Right.
And so easy, one to overlook, and in that situation, it can kind of confuse the valuation of the company too. How much cash flow do you have? Well, I don't pay anything for real estate, so I've got all this cash flow. But when you buy it, you're going to have to lease that building from me. And so smaller cash flow. So that's
Yeah.
something to think about as well.
Well, you mentioned about, brand and buying the business and everything else. And these days with uh, Yelp and Google and all these companies, wouldn't you say, before you and looking to purchase it or part of the due diligence is to look and see what their Google ranking is, what kind of reputation do they have? Because people more and more, I know in my law practice, people have told me, well, we decided to hire you because you've got all those 5-star reviews. So you might want to look and see what social proof there is and what kind of reputation's out there. If you're buying that name, is it a good name or is it a bad name? Right?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic point. Yep, exactly.
All right. So we've done all the due diligence, we've done all the analysis, uh, and I guess with we go to acquire, and
Mhm.
I guess that's the stage where you, in our real estate analogy, you're going to closing. Is that what this stage is? So before we get to closing, another question as far as where this money is coming from to purchase the business. You've done the letter of intent. I'm going to pay $2 million for this business, and we agree, okay. But where does that money come from? How do you get financing? Do you have any thoughts or ideas or tips for our listeners on getting financing or loans or VCs or whatever?
Hey, well, having a little money out of your own pocket can absolutely make it a lot easier to get the job done. Let's just take your $2 million business that you're kind of mentioned as an example. One of the really powerful tools for an individual looking to buy a business is the SBA, the Small Business Administration. It guarantees loans. So technically, you're not really borrowing from the SBA, but they're going to work with a bank and they're going to guarantee the loan with the bank. So the bank's risk of losing all its money if you don't pay them back is decreased dramatically. So the SBA, it's a little bit of a headache. There's a lot of paperwork, but you can finance up to typically at least 80, I've seen 90, and in some cases 95% of the purchase price with an SBA loan. Now, they've got limitations and they've got valuation requirements. They need a third-party valuation in many cases. These are really good ways that SBA financing is a really powerful way to buy that company you're looking at. And so if it's a $2 million business, rather than having to come up with $2 million or, even just to go, borrow from friends and family $2 million, 90% of that, would be what, 180 that or 1.8 millions. Yeah, so you'd only maybe come up with 200,000 and then borrow the other 1.8 million. And if it was 95%, be half of that. So that is where you're probably going to get the money for most of the time. And if the company's got some assets, if it's got accounts receivable, it's got inventory, it's got equipment, vehicles or land that you can roll together, that can make it even easier to get that type of financing.
All right, so we're at the acquire stage, the third step.
Yep.
So tell us about what folks should be doing and expect to have happen in this stage of the transaction.
Okay. Well, at this point, one of the things that really surprises people is how long it takes to get the paperwork done, to get the legal documents. I've had many people be like, well, can't we close, next week? And it's like, well, by the time it takes a while to get SBA financing, that can be 60 to 90 days. And just negotiating, and I mean, you're very well aware of this, Steve, negotiating the terms of the agreement is going to take a while. Both sides are going to have their attorneys involved, and you want to make sure you get it right. But every purchase agreement is almost a custom contract. It's not just, oh, we pull one off the shelf, we slap it down, and we're ready to go. And that process of back and forth, and I'm going to read it, and I'm going to have comments, and I'm going to talk to my attorney, and then here's my comments, and you read it and talk, that takes 30 to 60 days just to do that.
Right.
So if you kind of think from by the time, at the point you start talking to a company, first contact with the company, this looks interesting, to the point of going through initial discussions and LOI, due diligence, and then documents all the way to closing, that's easily 6 months, sometimes as long as a year. And that's something that people haven't really thought about, could be a surprise to them. So doing those documents is a big part of the closing and the kind of the acquire piece. Another part to think about that is easy to overlook is that running a business, just like running your house, you don't keep a zero, I hope you don't keep a, absolutely zero balance in your checking account. You've got a little money in there just for buffer, well, we've got a bill to pay, good, we've got a little bit of money in there. Well, business is the same thing. Of course, it's a little bit bigger. So how much money are you going to have to keep in that bank account?
Mhm.
And so many times a buyer will say, I need to make sure there's this much left in the bank account as part of the agreement too. And people, you know, if that's not included, at least know in your mind that you're going to need a little money to do that. So have that in your budget. So that's just a little tip that you don't get caught.
So we talked about the letter of intent, which you said is oftentimes an actual letter.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's really
so that
five, six
we,
pages.
but there's a later contract. You say you just don't take one off the shelf. It's finally crafted to this particular transaction. So there's actually a second document. You have your letter of intent and you have your actual sales document. What goes into that sales document that wasn't in the letter of intent? How do we get from one to the other through our analysis?
Right, right. Good question. So the letter of intent is 4, 5, 6 pages. Typically, could be a little longer, a little shorter. And it's a high level agreement, a meeting of, minds type of thing. This is, you and I talked. You like selling your business. This is the number, let's go forward. We do our due diligence. Now we've got this legal document that's going to spell out all these terms and conditions. Everything that a lawyer might worry about is going to be in there. And this is probably 20 to 50 page document. I've seen it be longer as well and some big deals, but it's got representations and warranties, representations that say, you haven't told me any, things that are false. And you're going to guarantee, you're going to warranty that these things are true. And it's going, that's a really important aspect of the contract, that purchase agreement. And I've even seen it's very common to get insurance to make sure that if the seller didn't tell you things that were accurate and true, you can buy an insurance policy to help compensate you so you're not caught. So it's just like insurance on a floods or house burning down and things like that. And it's also going to be much more detailed than the letter of credit, the letter of intent. Sorry. The letter of intent, might have a paragraph or 2 or 3 paragraphs about the price, where the final agreement, the purchase agreement, is going to have, probably a couple or 3 pages of how it's being paid out. And if there's a note, if there's loans, sometimes there's a loan that's going to be paid out over time from the buyer to the seller. So that's a whole related document, and it's going to be described in the purchase agreement. So there's a whole bunch of things in there that you unless you're an attorney doing this kind of stuff, you probably don't think about very often.
Right. Okay. So you got the document, and you finally get that together, get all the financing together, all the pieces together, and then you in effect go to closing, right?
Right,
Okay.
exactly. You've got a closing. Nowadays, those are often done virtually, but traditionally, yeah, you get in a conference room and you sign, 25 different documents. And then you get the keys. And in the course of the discussion, hopefully you've discussed, what the role of the seller is, how much training will be provided, how long they'll stick around, how long they're available to call, be available for calls. Is there a period when they agree not to steal your customers and not to compete with you? So those are also things that are included in that purchase agreement. So that's the kind of the post-closing process of
Mhm.
the acquisition. So,
Well, that's a lot of great information for listeners out there who are thinking about buying a business. Uh, And if they get that idea, say, yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think I like to look into buying a business. How can they reach out to you if they want your help in guiding them through uh, the waters, as it were, of buying a business? How can they reach out to you, and what services do you provide?
Right. My services are a fractional chief financial officer. And so I work on projects including, helping companies that are growing rapidly or companies or individuals that are acquiring companies. And they can reach out to me at abundant.com, ABUNDEN.com. And love to talk to you and see if I can be of help.
Okay. And I'll leave all your contact information and socials in the show notes. So if people want to know more about you, they can uh, check that out. So I appreciate you coming on the show. I'm sure our listeners learned a lot. At the very least, hit the important points so that they know what to start thinking about. They know what questions they need to ask, when they come to you or another agent for assistance in purchasing a business. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Steve.